My name is Adrian. I am 44 years old, and what you're about to hear is not a love story, but the account of how a carefully constructed lie can burn an entire family to the ground in a single afternoon. While my brother shouted in front of all the guests that I was a traitor and that I was sleeping with his future wife, the only thing I felt was a terrifying calm. You see, my brother was not defending his honor. He was digging his own grave while I was the one holding the shovel. He pointed his finger at me, called me trash, and expelled me from his life in front of 200 people, swearing that I was trying to steal the woman of his dreams. What he didn't know was that this woman wasn't a dream. She was a professional scammer, and I had proof that she was already married in another state and draining his bank accounts while he was choosing the color of the flowers. That day, I didn't lose a brother. I simply finished discovering the weak man he had become. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave your like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. My younger brother, Matthew, was always the kind of man who sees the world through a filter of naivete that I could never afford to have. I am 12 years older than him. While I was building my own logistics consulting company, spending sleepless nights reviewing contracts and learning to read people's hidden intentions in their smallest gestures, he was busy being the favored son, the eternal optimist who believed that love solved everything. Our relationship was stable, or at least that's what I believed. I was the pillar of the family, the one who solved financial problems and restored order when things got out of control. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and a silent envy that I only fully understood when Emily appeared. It all began 2 years ago. Matthew arrived at a family dinner with a smile that barely fit on his face, and a woman on his arm who looked as if she had stepped out of a catalogue of superficial perfection. Emily was young, beautiful, and possessed that almost surgical ability to say exactly what every person wanted to hear. My parents were immediately enchanted. She spoke about family values, about her supposed job as an administrator at a charity foundation, and about how Matthew was the man she had always dreamed of finding. But I don't buy rehearsed smiles. My work has taught me that when someone seems too perfect, it's usually because they're hiding the cracks under too much paint. From that very first night, I noticed details that everyone else ignored. Emily wore a limited edition watch that cost more than my brother's car, yet she claimed she lived modestly so she could help others. Her stories about her past had geographic inconsistencies that only someone who travels frequently would detect. When I asked about her university, she changed the subject with the agility that only an experienced liar possesses. Matthew, of course, was blind. To him, I was simply being the bitter and cynical older brother who couldn't stand to see someone happy. My skepticism was interpreted as arrogance. As the months passed, the balance of our family began to tilt dangerously. Emily moved in with Matthew within a few weeks. Soon, my brother began asking me for unusual loans. He said he wanted to invest in a joint venture with her, a supposed expansion of the foundation. Out of caution, I refused to give him the capital without seeing a real business plan. That was the first nail in the coffin of our brotherhood. Matthew felt insulted. Emily, with masterful subtlety, began planting the idea that I wanted to control him, that I didn't trust him, and that deep down I envied the life he was building. What Matthew couldn't see was the emotional vacuum she was creating around him. She isolated him from his longtime friends, suggesting they were bad influences or that they didn't understand his new status. I watched everything from an analytical distance. I'm not a man prone to emotional outbursts. I prefer data. I began to notice that Emily spent a lot of time out of town for supposed fundraising meetings, while my brother's credit cards reached their limits every month. The atmosphere at family gatherings became tense. I was the uncomfortable guest, the man who didn't smile at the new couple's displays of grandeur. Matthew had changed. The cheerful guy who used to ask me for advice about mechanics or investments had become a defensive man, always on guard, always protecting a woman he barely knew. One afternoon during a barbecue, I found him checking his phone with a look of panic. When I approached, He quickly put it away. I asked if everything was all right with the household accounts, and his response was a shout in front of our parents. He told me to stop watching him, that I wasn't his father, and that Emily was the best thing that had ever happened to him. That night I realized that my brother's emotional status was one of total dependence. He didn't love Emily. He was addicted to the validation she gave him. She made him feel important, the hero of a story she herself had invented. My position of success and stability, which had once been a source of pride for him, became the enemy. Emily made sure to turn my success into a personal offense in Matthew's mind. She told him I looked down on him, that my being single was proof that I didn't understand commitment, and that perhaps I secretly wanted what they had. It was in that environment of resentment that she began preparing her master move, making me appear to be the absolute villain, so that no one would listen to my warnings when the truth finally came out. I watched the disaster approaching at full speed, but at that moment I decided that if Matthew wanted to play the role of an independent adult, he would have to learn to deal with the consequences of his decisions. The stage was set for the fall, and the balance I had worked so hard to maintain in my family finally shattered the day they announced the wedding. A wedding that, according to her, had to be the most luxurious one our savings could possibly afford. The wedding planning turned into a silent battlefield where I was the only soldier who could see the ambush coming. Emily didn't just want a ceremony, she wanted a display of wealth that Matthew simply didn't possess, and to achieve that, she began weaving the web of my own expulsion. Everything accelerated a month before the event. I noticed Matthew avoiding me, looking at me with a mixture of disgust and contempt that I couldn't understand. My parents, usually warm with me, began answering my calls with monosyllables. Something was being cooked behind my back, and the smell of it was rotten. One Friday afternoon, Matthew burst into my office without knocking. He didn't shout, which was even more frightening. He just stood there, trembling with a contained rage that twisted his features. He threw a stack of printed photographs and screenshots of text messages onto my desk. In them, there was a man who looked very much like me from behind, entering a hotel with Emily. The messages were explicit, crude, supposedly sent from my personal number, begging her to leave my brother for me, saying that I could give her the life of luxury he would never be able to provide. They were cheap fabrications, but well-crafted enough for a man who was already predisposed to hate me. I stood up slowly, adjusting my jacket. I looked at the photos with the cold detachment of someone analyzing a damage report. Emily was playing her final card. If she managed to make Matthew hate me, no one would believe the financial evidence I was already gathering about her previous scams. She needed to remove me from the family map before the marriage certificate was signed, and she gained legal access to the family's properties. Matthew stepped closer to my face, his breath smelling of bitter coffee and desperation. He called me miserable. He said he had always known I envied him, that my lack of a stable partner was because I had always wanted what was his. I didn't react with shouting. Silence is my sharpest tool. I simply looked him in the eyes and told him to check the dates on those photos carefully, because that day I had been at a conference in another city. But he didn't want logic. He wanted someone to blame for his insecurity. He threw a punch that I barely dodged, the blow grazing my cheekbone. In that moment, moral justice became my only priority. The humiliation wasn't the punch itself, but seeing how my own brother, the blood of my blood, chose to believe a woman he had known for 2 years rather than the man who had helped raise him for 3 decades. That same night, there was a private rehearsal dinner I wasn't invited to, but that I heard about through a cousin. There, in front of my parents and the few friends he still had left, Matthew gave a toast that ended up becoming my social death sentence. He announced that I was no longer his brother, that I was banned from the wedding, and that any contact with me would be considered a betrayal against him. He told the lie about my supposed harassment of Emily, portraying her as a martyr who had tried to protect me out of love for the family until she could no longer bear the guilt. My parents, disappointed and hurt, didn't call me to hear my side of the story. They simply sent me a message saying they didn't want to see me at the church. I lost my seat at the family table. I lost the respect of my parents, who now saw me as a predator who had tried to destroy their younger son's happiness. I felt expelled from my own story. That night I stayed alone, staring at the city lights, feeling an icy rage moving through my veins. Matthew's betrayal wasn't the accusation itself. It was his lack of faith in my character. He preferred to believe I was a monster, rather than accept that he himself was the victim of deception. It hurt, yes, but the pain became the fuel for the precision of what would come next. They took away everything that meant belonging to them. They took away my right to defend my own family. Emily smiled victoriously on her social media, posting photos of the expensive wedding dress my brother had paid for, with a loan I had refused to guarantee, a loan he had eventually secured from questionable lenders. She believed she had won, that by removing me from the equation, there would be no one left to watch her movements. She felt safe on her throne of lies. What she didn't know was that by expelling me from the family, she had also removed any trace of mercy I might have had for them. I was no longer a brother trying to save another. Now I was a stranger, watching a parasite devour its host, simply waiting for the exact moment to turn on the light and let everyone see the rot. The expulsion was complete, the silence was absolute, and my decision was final. If they wanted a villain, I would give them one they would never forget. Silence is my natural habitat, and patience is my greatest resource. After being expelled from my family like a pariah, I didn't waste a single second on useless lamentation. I sat in my office, facing the city that never sleeps, and began drawing the map of Emily's downfall. An intelligent man doesn't fight with his fists when he can fight with information. The first thing I did was contact an old acquaintance, a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud and owed me a couple of significant favors. I didn't want hallway gossip. I needed notarized documents, bank records, and criminal histories that would be impossible to refute in front of a judge or in front of an audience of 200 people. My plan was not born out of impulse, but from a meticulous reconstruction of my own dignity. During the following 2 weeks, while Matthew posted photos of the final wedding preparations and my parents ignored my messages, I was immersed in databases that revealed a terrifying truth. Emily wasn't really named Emily, at least not legally. Her real name was Mariana, and she had a history of lightning marriages in 3 different states. Her method was always the same: find a vulnerable man, preferably from a family with liquid assets, isolate him from his circle of trust through false accusations of harassment or jealousy, and then disappear after the divorce with a substantial settlement, or worse, by emptying the joint accounts before the first crisis even appeared. My ally, the investigator, handed me a black leather folder containing the final blow. Mariana was still legally married to a man in the northern part of the country. She had never divorced him because, technically, she never used her real identity when getting married, only high-quality forged documents. The wedding with my brother wouldn't just be a moral betrayal, it would be a criminal act of bigamy and document fraud. But I couldn't simply send Matthew an email. He was so intoxicated by Emily's narrative that he would delete any message accusing her, claiming I was trying to sabotage his happiness again. The truth had to be public, unavoidable, and devastating. The strategy required cold precision. I quietly pulled some strings with the bank where my brother kept his primary account. Because I had been his financial guarantor in previous years, I still had access to certain activity reports. That's when I discovered that Emily had already convinced Matthew to transfer my parents' retirement savings, money I myself had helped manage for their future, into a new account under the pretense of a real estate investment for the newlyweds. She was only days away from delivering the final blow and disappearing. A stab of anger ran through me when I saw my brother's stupidity, but I suppressed it. Anger clouds judgment. Precision sharpens it. I met with my lawyer, a man who understands that sometimes the law is a surgical instrument used to correct moral deformities. "Adrian," he told me as he reviewed the evidence, "this isn't just deception. This is a professional fraud operation. If they get married, she'll gain legal rights over your family's assets. that will be a nightmare to reverse. I nodded with the calm of a chess player. I wasn't going to let them get married. I was going to let them reach the altar, let the priest ask the traditional question, and then watch the entire farce collapse at the moment of maximum exposure. I wanted the echo of her fall to be heard in every corner of our social circle. The reconstruction of my counterattack included contacting Mariana's last victim, a man who had ended up bankrupt and heartbroken 2 years earlier. When I explained what was happening, his voice trembled, but he agreed to send me a notarized testimony and the photographs from his own wedding to the woman who now called herself Emily. I had everything: the previous marriage certificate, the records of false identities, and screenshots of the bank movements she was already making from Matthew's computer. During those days, my behavior was that of a defeated man. I stopped calling. I stopped insisting. I let Emily believe that her lie about my supposed harassment had been the final blow. I watched her post stories celebrating her bachelorette party, wearing jewelry my brother couldn't possibly afford. I watched her smile at the camera with that artificial charm only I could see through. Every smile of hers became a note in my execution log. I was staging a play and she believed she was the star, unaware that I owned the theater and was about to close the curtain in the middle of the performance. There were no doubts, no regrets. My brother had called me trash in front of everyone. Now I would show him who was truly covered in mud. The patience was about to end, and the climax was approaching with the precision of a Swiss watch. I was ready for the wedding day. The wedding day finally arrived. I didn't show up at the church, just as they had ordered, but I made sure my presence would be felt like a hammer striking fragile glass. The place was a display of opulence financed with lies and the life savings of my parents. While Matthew stood at the altar, wearing the suit I had helped him choose months earlier before Emily poisoned his mind, I was standing a few meters from the entrance, watching from the emotional distance of a surgeon. I knew she would arrive radiant, wrapped in white silk, ready to seal the theft of our family's inheritance. But I wasn't going to allow the word "I do" to be spoken. My revenge was not an act of anger. It was an act of hygiene. Minutes before the wedding march began to play, I sent a digital file to the phones of everyone present. I had collected the numbers from the guest list weeks earlier. It was a simple link, a short, direct video showing Emily, or rather Mariana, at her previous wedding just 18 months earlier, with the man from the northern state she had left completely ruined. The video ended with a clear image of her still valid marriage certificate and a series of screenshots showing the bank transfers she had made that very morning from my parents' savings account into an offshore account. The murmur in the pews started as a whisper and quickly turned into a roar of disbelief. I walked into the church just as Emily was walking down the central aisle. The silence became heavy, dense like lead. Matthew saw me and his face shifted from confusion to blind fury. He stepped down from the altar, ready to drag me out by force, shouting how I dared to ruin the happiest day of his life after what I had supposedly done to his fiancée. Emily stopped in place, the mask of perfection beginning to crack. I didn't say a single word. I simply raised my phone and pointed toward the giant screen they had installed to display romantic photos of the couple. My ally in the sound booth, a technician I had paid triple his rate, replaced the romantic slideshow with the criminal evidence I had prepared. There, in front of 200 people, appeared the photos of Emily with her other 3 husbands. The identity documents followed, each with different names but the same cynical face. Then came the criminal record for fraud that she had managed to hide by slightly altering the spelling of her legal surname. Matthew froze halfway down the aisle. He stared at the screen and then at the woman dressed in white. She tried to cry, tried to hug him, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, claiming that I had manipulated the images out of jealousy. But the final proof was physical. Mariana's legal husband, the man she thought she had left behind, walked through the main doors escorted by my investigator. Emily's collapse was cinematic. There were no screams of innocence, only a deathly silence followed by a desperate attempt to run toward the sacristy. Matthew grabbed her arm, not with love but with the grip of someone who had just realized he had been sleeping beside a snake. He looked into her eyes, searching for the woman he had fallen in love with. But all he found was a cornered scammer. My parents, seated in the front row, looked pale, holding their phones where the proof of their drained savings was still visible. I approached my brother, stopped 1 meter away from him, and handed him a physical copy of the dossier. There was no satisfaction on my face, only absolute coldness. "I told you she wasn't who she claimed to be, Matthew," I whispered, a whisper that echoed through the entire church. He couldn't hold my gaze. The humiliation was total, not only because of the scam, but because he had sacrificed his own blood for a lie so obvious. Emily was escorted out by the event security that I had quietly reinforced beforehand. The guests began leaving in uncomfortable silence, abandoning the flowers, the 5-tier cake, and the shattered illusions of a man who had chosen blindness over the advice of his own brother. The wedding did not end in celebration. It ended like the scene of an emotional crime, where every one of her lies was exposed under the harsh light of the truth. The echo of the guests' footsteps leaving was the only sound that remained in that hall decorated for a lie. Matthew sat on the steps of the altar, his tie undone and his gaze lost in the void. My parents tried to approach me, their eyes full of tears and an apology trembling on their lips, but I simply raised a hand to stop them. I wasn't looking for late apologies or reconciliation hugs. The damage caused by an accusation of that magnitude cannot be erased with a simple, "I'm sorry." They chose to believe a stranger instead of trusting the integrity of the man who had always supported them. That is a debt time cannot repay. Emily disappeared that very night, probably searching for her next victim somewhere else, although the legal complaint for fraud and bigamy is already underway. My brother tried to call me several times in the weeks that followed. He sent long messages, crying, saying he had ruined his life and that I had been right. I didn't answer a single one. There are lessons that can only be learned in absolute solitude, and Matthew needed to understand that loyalty is not something you can trample on and then demand back when the ground collapses beneath your feet. He didn't ruin his wedding because of me. He ruined it the day he decided that my honor was worth less than the whim of a con artist. Today, my life continues with the same discipline it always had. My company prospers, and my social circle is now much smaller, but infinitely cleaner. I don't hold resentment, because resentment is a heavy burden, and I prefer to walk lightly. However, there is no going back. I learned that blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. And in that church, I lost a brother. Sometimes people ask if I was too cruel for waiting until the last moment to expose the truth. My answer is always the same. The truth has its own rhythm, and some people need to stand at the edge of the cliff to understand they are already falling. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It is watching life collect its debts. I sat and watched the spectacle because they themselves turned on the stage lights. Now each of them lives with the consequences of their blindness, and I live with the peace of someone who has nothing to hide. Moral justice is not always sweet. Often it is cold and lonely, but it is necessary to maintain order in a world full of masks. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave your like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories.